Good morning. Donut and I are going to go through Donut's Worlds run. Donut was playing in the second half of Worlds, the big stage where everyone cares, instead of my pathetic part where it was just the championship rounds. We're going to go over his decks, what the prep was like, and then the games themselves, as we've always done with the VODs. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah. Hi guys. I'm Donut or Donut LOR in some locations. Um, so nice to talk to everyone. I don't think most people have spoken to me before. So
This is going to be our table of contents. I'll probably put this in the chapters mechanic. But in general, because I think because we had access to the prep phase, for us the prep phase was like a large part of what Worlds ended up being, but no one really has access to the prep phase, so I did want to talk about like what that was like a little bit. And then we'll just go over the games. You've already talked about yourself. If you want to like talk about like tournament experience, but you haven't really had as much.
yeah, sure. So I've been playing this game competitively for a little bit over a year, and last year I started far too late in the Worlds run to make a real run at Worlds. But this year that was one of my main goals, was to qualify for the Worlds qualifiers, like the play-ins. So I was very excited to have even made it there. And then I just went 4-0. I had some pretty good prep and was really happy with my deck lists, and I think a lot of teams weren't. So I think we're going to talk about that on the next slide. But yeah, I've been playing this game competitively for a little over a year, and I've just barely missed seasonals top cut by one win for the past maybe four seasonals. So
Yeah, and you've had like previous card game experience, right? Like from memory, you played MTG for a little bit.
yeah, I played MTG, like Friday Night Magic, every week for years in middle school and high school. And then I played Hearthstone a lot in high school. I have maybe top 500 Legend a few times, but nothing compared to my sort of success in Legends of Runeterra, with making it to Worlds and being front page once or twice, being top 30 once or twice. So
Yeah. Okay. Your lineup for the WCQs, as Boulevard keeps acronymizing it to me, despite no one else ever doing that, was Red Gwen, Sarah Victor, SI, and Vayne Harpy. And your like Vayne Harp deck was like the most unique out of all of these. Do you want to talk about like the WCQs a little bit more? Or?
yeah, so when I was preparing for it, Vayne Harp was probably the first deck in my lineup. Assuming it was good into the meta after my prep. I had a sort of week or 5 day break maybe from the game, a week before the WCQ deck lists were due, and so I came back from that and was preparing and looking through my deck list, and this was the first thing that came to mind. I'd been playing Vayne PNZ since day one of patch, and had my scavenged camo cloaker tech in there from also pretty much day one of patch, and this deck just crushed for me throughout the whole season in Aegis and on ladder. Um, Anytime I played it, I would end up on the Runeterra.ar like top players list with my list, and
Right. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I don't know, no one else was really on the scavenged camo cloaker tech, and everyone else was really high on fish fight. So I liked cutting down on fish fight because it felt often like a win more card, and I much preferred Cataclysm specifically against a lot of the control decks, because I would play Fish Fight to kill a threat like Heimerdinger or Seraphine, but Cataclysm often would do the same thing since those cards have such low attack value, while also threatening a rally throughout the course of the game. Um, in addition, I preferred Mystic Shot as a much more flexible piece of interaction. The deck definitely needed interaction so that it had outs and chances against aggro, but Mystic Shot let you cut one drops and a little bit of interaction for burn and over the top against slower matchups, while also being some just good interaction against aggro or mid range. Um, Another interesting piece in this deck is the Chempunk Pickpocket. That was, I think, popularized very early on in the season by Rubenzu, and then eventually fell out of favor. I'm not too sure as to why that card stopped seeing play, but that card does really, really good work. So that's pretty
Yeah.
much the deck list. I don't know. Maybe the other weird thing is Fiora as a two of. In my testing, I just found that the champions weren't very good, specifically against like Heimerdinger Jace. I tested a lot against that deck. And also they weren't great in mid-range matchups. So only running 5 champions just sort of felt right. Fiora was pretty consistently worse than Ranger Knight Defector. And I didn't want that giant pile of 4-drops. Made my deck very clunky. So
Yeah, I remember playing this deck a little. I didn't end up bringing it, but I remember like when we were practicing that I really liked how this was built, and even looking at it now, I just like it. It just everything fits together and it looks clean to me. Um, with all
yeah, I
the
think that's one of the things I excel at in this game. I often will take a pretty good list and refine it. I feel very, very happy with the exact build of my decks anytime I enter a tournament. So
yeah. Uh, I want to talk a little bit about like who did you prep with and like what was the sort of prep like for Worlds, considering like it's a very exclusive experience considering I'm only like 16 plus I don't know 5 to 10 people for each of the
yeah,
16.
um, so I prepped with my Aegis team, and then also with you Spidz, of course, and Eniamore. I also got Vinicius Luigi and his friend Quaco. I met them in Santa's Discord. I think Luigi 9-0'd the last seasonal on
Yeah,
the same lineup as me, basically. Um, and so I knew he was pretty good at the game and didn't have many other connections. So I definitely had to look for people to test with. I think a lot of other competitors had pretty large test groups that they were playing with and testing things.
yeah,
But testing went really well. It was so fun to just have access to all the cards and um, have enough of like a monetary incentive to just grind the game all day. It's very fun to play the game for as high as stakes as that was. Um, the downside is I also had finals at the same time, so I didn't get to prepare as much as I would have wanted to for the stakes of the tournament.
yeah. I remember like the day that the decks were released, or something like that. Something like the day the decks were released. You couldn't scrim all day because you were too busy like doing your final. And so
Yeah,
like Jansport and I were like screaming for you, but like what value does that have? You're the one that's trying to learn the decks. Um,
yeah. So um, I was supposed to have a final the same day as I was actually playing games, and my professor extended the days that it was available to a few days before and after that Friday. So I actually started my final and my studying for it and finished it online on that Wednesday, so that I could have it like off my shoulders and done
yeah,
for actually playing in Worlds.
yeah. It was a very awkward experience, for sure. Like, you had a lot going on. I wanted to go
Yeah,
over the 3 deck lists. The first one is what Jansport and I, at the very least, kept calling Aatrox doing cartwheels. After this one time when, like, Jansport angrily said you just make Aatrox do a fucking cartwheel and win the game. Uh, Cartwheel being tumbled here. Do you want to talk about your list? Because it was definitely different from what most Aatrox lists were in the Top Cut.
yeah. So this was actually probably my favorite of the lists that I brought. And I had some hot takes about it. Definitely the Darkened Staff slash Ballcucks um,
We got shit
were
on.
hot takes compared to what the rest of the tournament brought. And also only playing 2 of the Darken Harp was a, I guess, seemingly wrong take, but we had pretty good reasons for every card in our deck. Um, and I think I'll go over that. Also, the one of Aatrox was pretty unique, and some people really liked it and others didn't. Overall, though, I'd stand by most of the decisions I made building this deck. Um, so the first big one I would want to go over is the Darken Staff. Um, this card felt so good in testing, and I don't know if I ever drew it in Worlds, but it's a lot better than it looks. Um, the general idea behind it is that it sort of generates 2 mana on strike because it discounts your World Ender. And in my experience, the Aatrox decks play World Ender almost every game. And so having that on a 1 mana weapon was really powerful. in addition, it was just a cheap weapon that you could play to guaranteed draw Aatrox. So this list is playing 11 equipments, whereas normally Aatrox lists that I saw were playing only 9 equipment or 10 equipment, but 2 to 3 copies of Aatrox. And so by playing more equipment, we can consistently draw Aatrox while also having like a more consistent aggressive early curve. And the main thing that this deck kind of focused on was consistency. Like you see a lot of 3-ofs and very few 1-ofs or 2-ofs. The best curve sort of with this deck was 1 or 2 1-drops and 1 or 2 1-mana equipments. So what else is there to talk about that I listed? The one of Aatrox. Basically, we cut the Aatroxes just to have more equipment density so that you can consistently draw Aatroxes. Because in our testing experience, which I think might be wrong, we might have been testing in too insular of a meta, but the Aatrox champion spell was not super high value, and you always wanted an Aatrox on 6. So weirdly enough, playing only 1 Aatrox made you more consistently play Aatrox on 6 than playing 3, because we often found we were losing games or very behind just to drawing too many copies of Aatrox equipment and spells, and just not enough units to play them on. So by cutting out a few more of those bricks, you made the deck a lot more consistent.
Yeah. I do think our testing was a little insular in that we were testing probably inordinately a lot against Seraphine. Like, for some reason, we were really thinking about, like, making sure that we were beating the Seraphine matchup in a group where I don't think we were expecting Seraphine that much anyway. But
yeah, I think we tested against Seraphine, and then a lot of the other concepts or piles we tested against were pretty unoptimized versions. Whereas we came to this relatively optimized Aatrox deck day 1 or 2 of testing. And so it just crushing everything felt like it was because we had a very clean, like lean Aatrox deck that was very well built. But it's likely that it was crushing everything because the everything we were playing it against just wasn't built and optimized very well for the meta. A good example of that is against Roji's Malphite deck. In testing, I was crushing Malphite, but against Roji's well-built, optimized Malphite deck with Sunburst as tech for Aatrox, it was a pretty big flip to the matchup, and that matchup became pretty hard.
Yeah. Another card that we went on was the Darkened Star. Not the Darkened Star, Darkened Spear.
Spear.
Yeah,
the Darkened Spear. That card we just didn't test very much because we found and sort of fell in love with the Darkened Staff so early. Looking back, that card seemed to crush and everyone else loved it. So we probably should have put more testing on it. But I think the Darkened Staff is still underrated. Going back, I'd probably bring at least 1, maybe 2 of that card.
Yeah.
And then rework the equipment. Because often, in my experience, the Aatrox mirror comes down to who plays World Ender first, and the Darkened Staff is so good at ramping that out. Unfortunately, we didn't get to see much Darkened Staff on display at Worlds.
Yeah. And I do think our mindset for the Cartwheel deck was a bit different from, I think, a lot of other people's mindset, where we were thinking of it as like a scouts with a top end of the World Ender, right? Like, we've got all these 1-drops that we're like spamming out with these weapons. And the amount of times we would have like a double 1-drop Zealous Ranger Knight and 2 weapons was just like much larger than you think. But I think the way other people were seeing it was a much more grindier game where you let your first Aatrox die sometimes and you sort of heal 8 HP with an Aatrox and then win through outvalue. And I don't think we played for that as much. Like, it's still possible, obviously. But
yeah,
I think that's like a big fundamental difference in the way that we viewed these decks.
Yeah, I think in the big picture, we built an Aatrox deck mostly for beating control, whereas a lot of the other Aatrox decks were teched to beat other Aatrox and mid-range.
Yeah.
And then we dedicated sort of a few cards in this deck for the mirror, specifically like Kind-Hearted Recruit, which that card was incredible in testing, and the one time I played it, it almost saved a game at Worlds. I think that card is really good. But also just sort of on the hope that playing World Ender a turn early because we're a little bit more aggressive is all that you need for your mid-range matchup. And we kind of said that, okay, we aren't going to have as much value because the tempo swing of playing an early World Ender just wins you the game anyways, which is sort of true, but often the Aatrox games were able to be slowed down enough that you couldn't actually strike much and make an early World Ender, in my experience. So
The last card that I want to talk about is Tempting Prospect. I know the day before we submitted this, you were still on 2 Tempting Prospect, and you really liked the card, even though I think everyone managed to talk you down to 1. Do you want to talk about Tempting Prospect and why you like that so much?
Yeah, so Tempting Prospect, it's just a sort of fail-safe for the deck. When you're playing 11 copies of equipment and 17 units, like equipment require units to function and units also require equipment. It's a lot like a discard deck where you have like Get Exciteds and Poro Cannons that really require your Fallen Riders or Might, like whatever your discard pieces that you're aiming to discard in deck building with are. And some of the most powerful cards in any deck like that are the ones that can act as either a discard outlet or a discard target, or in this example, either a unit or an equipment. And so that's why we were on the Tempting Prospect. I ended up cutting it down to 1 because really with this deck, what you wanted to be doing almost every game was playing some 1-drops and some early equipment. And spending 1 more mana on a 1-drop makes it a lot worse, especially in that early curve where you're trying to apply pressure. So it, while being very flexible, was too much of a power sacrifice to make it consistently good. I think you could cut that card for something. I think maybe Concerted Strike would have been a good call for the meta I ended up playing against. But it's a nice, just consistent, flexible piece to the deck that I don't particularly regret bringing.
Yeah, I think that's all I wanted to get you to talk about the Aatrox. I think it was definitely our most unique deck because of the 1 Aatrox, the iCardo comment where we couldn't afford it. But
yeah, that was pretty funny.
Yeah. I'm going to go next to Red Gwen, which is, I mean, this deck's been around for a while, but we did change a few things in it. Do you want to talk about Red Gwen?
Yeah, so the main change that I had with this list, I would say, is Crimson Pigeon. That card, particularly in this deck, just takes over a ton of games for you. So many times in testing, this thing would get its first attack and turn into a 3/3, and then your opponent doesn't deal with it for 1 turn, and now they're looking at a 4/4 1-drop attacking them. It just applies so much pressure and grows so much larger than it needs to. And really was a lot better than the Legion Rearguard that I played in this deck in the World's Qualifiers. The other difference is Redeemed Prodigy. This card also performed super well as sort of a replacement for the landmark that also creates, I believe they're called Ghastly Bands.
Mm-hmm.
The main problem with that landmark that made Ghastly Bands was it was a super high power level card for the deck, but it had a huge downside of sometimes clogging up your harrowing, which is your main win condition in some matchups. And so that landmark being so powerful but having that big downside was really weird and hard to fit into the deck when deck building. But Redeemed Prodigy did a very similar thing to that, which was create multiple hollowed procs, and it didn't clog your harrowing nearly as much. We found in testing, I think, that the best curve against a lot of matchups was Crimson Pigeon into Redeemed Prodigy. And so the deck getting like a new 1 and 2 drop curve that was better than what it had before was really, really powerful. Because the Crimson Pigeon can deal 1 damage to your 2/2, leaving it alive, so you're swinging 3 wide for 7 damage with a hollowed trigger on turn 2. And that was just such a powerful curve to add to an already incredibly powerful and consistent deck. Overall, there weren't too many changes to my deck list, and I was pretty happy with how this deck was built. It didn't perform great for me at Worlds, but I don't think that's necessarily the fault of the deck or the build. Mainly, what I would want to say is just Crimson Pigeon compares so favorably to Legionary Guard, which was what we were playing before it. So it was a very cool new tech.
Yep, I think the rest of the deck is pretty stock standard. Like, you can argue against Shadow Isles, Telestone, and a bunch of other, like, one-of tech cards, but in general, like, this is the way the deck has been built for quite a while now.
Yeah, you kind of have a trade-off of Shadow Isles, Telestone versus Mark of the Isles that some people talk about. I know Aragorn cut the Quietus and maybe the SI Telestone, I think, for 3 Legion Rearguard in his list, which was a really interesting meta call that I didn't like, but it worked really well for him. He, won Worlds, so.
Yeah. One thing I forgot to mention is that, like, arguably, based on, like, numbers, I think you may have had the hardest group, considering, like, one of your people went to first and one of your people went to, like, third or fourth, from memory.
Yeah.
So technically, if anything, you had the hardest group, even if, like, everyone was saying the Teddy and Tankbuster group was, like, the hardest. But the way they were the same group?
Yeah, so what you're saying is I got 10th and not 16th?
Basically. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, talk about the final list is Purifying, Elusives, or Teemo Zoe. Which is like, I've got a lot of thoughts about this deck, but I want you to explain, like, how we came to
Yeah, so this deck was a sort of last-minute pivot in our Worlds testing. We tested it a little bit on the first day, and it didn't feel powerful enough, I think, because it wasn't optimized very well. But my original lineup that I was planning to bring a few days before Worlds Decklists were due was Aatrox, Red Gwen, and Champion Strength with no champions in it. It was a lot like the Jinx deck. I just didn't particularly like how Jinx worked in that Jinx Champion Strength deck. But when I played that deck, it just felt a little bit too inconsistent and was losing games that I felt like I couldn't be losing in Worlds. So I had to get rid of that and find another deck that felt like it would be good into other Aatroxes and Talia Malphite. And Purifying Elusives or Teemo Zoe was exactly that deck. It was very difficult to beat if you were a slow, mid-rangey Shurima deck or an Aatrox deck. Especially like the Purifying Flames on turn 3 or 4 into 2 Elusives curve, where you attack for 7-ish damage. When you have your attack token there, is just crushing. You can do almost nothing about it. So,
yeah.
Did you have other thoughts or
yeah.
questions about the tech?
Yeah, so we have a one of Blinded Mystic. From memory, we were using that to hit the Scout Guide and a few other things.
Yeah, so Blinded Mystic is really good against the Scout card. It's pretty good to just buff any of your elusive units. I thought that there might be more elusives at Worlds than there were. There was one other player who brought them. And so it was really good in the elusives mirror. But it just hit a surprising amount of cards. And when you have the really large elusives, making them even bigger just is pretty good against most of the removal and decks that we were playing against. This deck was pretty often just blocking a large Demacia unit and killing it because it had a 6/6 elusive. And so that's kind of the idea of what the deck was doing. This deck is very different from the previous elusives decks. We cut a lot of the cheaper elusives for big buffs. You don't see the flight in here. And this deck was very often and pretty consistently getting 4 or 5 power elusives. Something like a 5/6 Bandle Commando is like a very realistic stat line to see with this deck. And it really just crushed mid-range decks. It was banned in 2 out of 3 rounds, and I think arguably should have been banned by all 3 of my opponents.
Yeah.
The other tech card, I think, is the Expanses Protection. That card we put in specifically because of Quicksand. I knew Roji would be on some Shuriman mid-range decks. And also, who else in my group? Was it Chenia that qualified? No, it wasn't Chenia.
Aragorn qualified.
Aragorn. Yeah, Aragorn qualified with Sundisk, which plays Quicksand. And so we speculated that he would like some kinds of Shurima mid-range or control decks, which she ended up bringing with that Talia Ziggs Black Flame deck. So
one comment I wanted to make was that since we cut Purple Berry Shake, when we were watching Worlds, I noticed that someone was on like a P&Z version of this deck where they were running Quarigan and that sort of thing. Do you think, in hindsight, you would have preferred to pivot towards a P&Z version of the deck?
yeah, so I actually saw that on day one and saw it being played and was really interested. And I thought it might have been better than the deck that I was playing. But seeing it perform in game or seeing how it worked in game, it just didn't feel as powerful. So I'm not sure exactly why that is. Maybe he just got unlucky. But in general, conceptually, that deck seems really good and like a better version of what I was trying to do. If we had more time, maybe we would have iterated to that same spot. But I haven't tested the deck enough to say for sure that I think it's better. I definitely really enjoyed the idea though, and thought it was good.
Yeah. What I was thinking was that like we've only got 2 1-drops that are elusive, and my thinking was that like at least Poro Cannon allows us to have like a 2 combo with Purifying Flames and Poro Cannon. Like since we're not on the flight and there's not any other like elusives we really want to go for 1 mana. Like that's what really appealed to me with PNZ, but like you're right, it didn't show up as much.
Yeah, Poro Cannon and also Acorn are huge pluses because, like I said, the best curve with this deck was Purifying Flames on 3 into 2 large elusives before your attack token. So if it's turn 3 and you have the attack token, you need 2 1-drops for that best case scenario curve. And I really liked that his deck leaned more heavily into making that work.
Yeah. Overall, I think all of our lists were interestingly built. But Red Gwen was sort of like, it was already going to be built in the way that it was. And I think that our logic was often correct. It was more whether the logic was garnered from like good advice or like proper matchup testing, right? Like with Aatrox, we were pretty happy with how it felt, especially with Dark and stuff, into the things that we were playing against. And the Aatrox deck felt as if it was like the most powerful thing it could be. And that might just be because Aatrox is already the most powerful thing it could be.
Yeah, I think Aatrox definitely was the most simple, powerful thing, which when you're going into a meta that maybe like 30 people have played, simplicity definitely is a huge part of power. Like we didn't find, I think, that Acolyte's deck that was broken just because it takes so much time to test, and we didn't have really the time to do that.
I remember day one I made an Acolyte's deck. It was like one of the 2 decks that I made was Acolytes and the Pigeon Sejanus thing. But I tried making it as like a Xerath Zillion control deck because I just thought I don't want to be stupid and go all in on Acolytes here. That would just be too memey. So I thought I'd make it a Xerath Zillion, and then it wasn't great. But like we only had so much time, right? Like you can work around the clock, but you've got to balance between like refining a deck, discovering decks, thinking about lineups. That there just wasn't that much time to like be too explorative. At least that's what I think.
Yeah, I think there was also the problem of there being like a lot of very interesting, potentially incredibly powerful cards. It's not like Acolyte's Reliquary was the only maybe broken card in the set. We had like the Black Flame and Rock Bear Shepherd. There were a few other clearly potentially really powerful cards that you had to find shells for and test against. So
we spent a lot of time on not a lot of time, but a fair bit of time on like Black Flame Ari Cannon, right? Either putting Cannon in the flame or like an elusive in the flame from Vayne.
Yeah.
Which I'm mostly saying just to like show that there was a lot of things that we tested like maybe once or twice and just couldn't figure out if it was worth the time. To really like go all in and then also see if it's good for the meta and then also see if it fits in a lineup without creating a weak point. Like making a lineup's already hard enough, and now we've got to do it with testing if the cards are powerful.
Yeah, and you have to do it blind, not knowing what the rest of the meta is. It's definitely a really tough challenge. So
yeah. I think that's all I wanted to go for this. So now we can go into like the actual VOD review part against Roji.
Sure.
So in the first round we have you versus Roji. Going into this, we knew we had to ban the Melfman because the Melfman was just like beating our decks up, especially with the Sunburst.
Yeah, Sunburst and Rite of Negation as
Yeah.
a combo just made the Aatrox matchup really bad. Whereas in testing, without those, or without specifically some Sunburst, it was a pretty reasonable matchup.
Yeah, and the other decks Roji brought was the Cultist, Silveraktion, Varus, and do you remember the other one?
He brought his own Vayne Aatrox deck.
That's right. He also brought Cartwheels. Yeah, and so
yeah,
I think going into this, we thought that it was going to be like mostly 50-50s, maybe a bit unfavored because the Varus deck would have like Frostbite, but I don't think we were feeling like too awful.
So I scrimmed the Varus matchup a lot and lost it a lot, but I think 5 or 6 games in a row, Jansports drew Auction into the 3-mana Glaive weapon, which pretty much what that told me is drawing those 2 cards meant you had an almost unbeatable hand, particularly for a low interaction deck like Aatrox. Also, the Unforgiving Cold is just very premium interaction that's relatively hard to beat, but it is beatable. So
yeah. I guess we'll just start the game.
Respect not wanting
I think we could talk about the mulligan.
Sure.
So this is a really interesting hand, I think, on my side. I guess mostly the interesting part is how many fish fights I want. Fish fight is the only interaction in my Aatrox deck, and it's really premium interaction, but you also want a good mix of creatures and equipment. So I think what I end up doing, if I remember correctly, is I keep one fish fight and mulligan the other one.
Yeah, I think when I was watching, I think that's what I wanted you to do as well.
I think I might mulligan the fish fight and draw another fish fight, if I remember correctly.
I'm pretty sure you end up playing 2 in this game. So that might have been what happened. But like the Fleet for the Blood Lettuce combo was like one of the main things that we liked, right? Like having a small man and like a 1-mana equipment just felt like really powerful.
But yeah, looking at my hand, it's, I would say, pretty good. Roji has already mulliganed and has a also pretty good hand. He kept the Unforgiving Cold and the Furious Wielder, and that really informed my plays. I think he kept 3 of the 4 cards in his hand. He might have even kept all 4. They don't show us. I think they joined the game a little bit late.
Yeah. I guess we'll just start. Tell me when you want to pause.
Sure.
Sometimes your answers to elusives just don't come up when you need them to.
So the main thing with him keeping those cards is I think he kept 3 cards and only played one of his kept cards by turn 4. So I had a huge read this game that they were either Unforgiving Cold or Furious Wielder.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, so I mulligan a fish fight, draw a Cataclysm, and then draw fish fight on the draw. So I have a very awkward hand now.
Yeah.
Roji here is an interesting predict.
Yeah, this predict, like from memory, I think most of us didn't want him to take the Glaive. Like Vagabond or Varus both seemed like better picks, and he takes Glaive from memory. Having played the deck, I see why he takes Glaive now. Like I'm bringing this to Aegis this week. And I can see the logic for Glaive, but as a spectator, just seeing his hand and then seeing that Glaive was the pick was very good. What do you think about this?
Yeah, I think Glaive was one of the best cards in the deck, as much as I hate to say it.
Yeah, me too.
I think the card is really actively bad in a lot of matchups. Like if your opponent has Quietus, you don't really want Swinging Glaive. But in mid-rangey, like the Demacia Mirrors, when you draw that card, it's incredibly powerful. Although a lot of its power comes from leveling Warlord's Palace with Auction or Vagabond. So I think I might have actually preferred Vagabond here. I think maybe he's thinking that the stats are a advantage for Swinging Glaive, but just looking at the board right now, I don't think that the extra +1/+1 is very relevant when I have a Fleet Feather tracker. So yeah, I would have preferred the Vagabond, and I'm almost able to win this game against Roji because he doesn't ever get a Palace, or at least he gets one very late into the game. So
it's just like this is like, despite it being on turn 1, this is like one of the more pivotal plays in like this game, and it's just interesting to see it happen so early.
I've got a 1-drop.
got a tech card that is specifically good in this matchup.
And with the Forsaken Bakai going for a predict here, very interesting options offered. Varus is going to tutor himself to the hand a little bit later on, but...
And looking at our hand, what we really want is both like units and weapons to draw Aatrox and also do like the early unit stuff. Having 3 pieces of interaction time, as you said, very important.
Yeah. We only play 4 pieces of interaction because we can get hands like this where we have a lot of equipment and interaction that just don't do much. So we have a very awkward hand right now.
That's right. Sorry, I've not rewatched these. I just remembered that like my main takeaway after every single game was Danny had a bad hand. And normally like that's such like a it's sort of like guys I was lagging. Like it's a very like the more you say it, like the less true it becomes in like a real sense. But I think you had some really awful hands. And while half of it, or like, I don't know, 20% of it could be ascribed to like maybe our deck building philosophy was wrong from the get-go. I genuinely think that your hands were just awful nearly all tournament.
Yeah, I think 2 or 3 of the 6 games I played at Worlds, I had like maybe bottom 5% hands.
Yeah.
Having played the deck at least 20 times, I can say that I drew that poorly maybe once, maybe twice in testing.
Yeah.
And so they were particularly terrible hands. And this game is almost one of them because I have the Fleet Feather tracker. I know you and I both played 1 game a piece where we drew literally no units, only equipment and interaction. So it's not that bad, but it's pretty close.
Like when I'm thinking of like the low roll for the Cartwheel deck, my thinking is like I've got 2 Bloodletters, 2 Durals, and no units, and I'm passing until turn like 6 until I finally draw something.
Yeah, I think that's like maybe bottom like 2 or 3% of your your hands, whereas this is pretty close to that, but not all the way down there. So
Picks it up here. He's got, you know, the buff on this unit. It's very slow early game because he doesn't quite want to trade.
So here Roji equips the Bloodletters. I think it would have been a lot worse for me if he open attacked. Like the fact that I get my Bloodletters down almost saves my hand. My Fleet Feather dying will give me another unit to equip, which will then draw my Aatrox and sort of start the ball rolling on my Dex game plan. And so I'm going to, I think, take this open attack for the trade, because my hand has nothing going on, and getting another equip really progresses my Aatrox level. Also having a 4-3 to fish fight from is really valuable.
Yeah. I think watching this, I didn't necessarily want you to do this attack, because I didn't want you to take 4 damage from the Dark Control for no reason, but I think, like, with how awkward our hand was, we sort of need to do these plays to sort of start spiraling into getting our Aatrox, and we need to, like, be actively killing off our units to turn this 1 Bloodletters into anything going on. So I think, like, watching this back, I really think this attack has to be forced, even if it's, like, indicative of an awkward hand, because like I don't think we want to do this trade on air attack turn when they get the Bloodletters.
Yeah, we need to replay our Bloodletters here to draw our Aatrox eventually.
Yeah.
And yeah, we just have a very crushingly awkward hand. But Roji sort of does too. He's drawn into too much interaction, and he has the Swinging Glaive. He has very few units currently in his hand.
Now this is maybe the most pivotal play. Like the turn 1 predict was, but I think this play sort of causes and breaks the game.
I actually think I made a mistake later in this game running out of timer.
It was like this game.
I think that might have been more relevant. Yeah, that was in this game. This game is a really long one.
Yeah,
so,
okay. I remember this one.
So here Roji open passes. And what he's doing is threatening Merciless Hunter, and I think hoping for a pass because his hand is pretty awkward. I miss that he's representing Merciless Hunter. I like quickly look over at his deck list. You might see that on the camera in a second, and just don't see the Merciless Hunter. But there is still a valid reason for my play, which is those 2 cards on the left of Roji's hand have been sitting there for a very long time. And Roji's deck has a lot of bricks and hard-to-use interaction pieces, like these Furious Wielders and Unforgiving Colts. So when he makes this pass to me, I know that there's a chance that he has a reasonable development and is trying to punish me for developing. But with how awkward my hand was this game, it felt like I'm supposed to develop and try to punish those awkward hand states that he could have. Although obviously at the time, not knowing that there was a Merciless Hunter in the deck because I just misread the deck list, I didn't evaluate the upside versus downside of developing and getting punished. Although this here does not actually go particularly bad for me. I'm able to fish fight from a different unit, I believe. Or no, sorry, I play Cataclysm here. And the reason for that is to play around the Unforgiving Cult and the Furious Wielder in Roji's hand. Getting the Scout attack, like the Scout trigger, so that I can deal 4 damage with my Dark Enthrall is very worthwhile in this spot if I'm able to get the Scout attack with my 4/3. And I think it's actually very important that I use my fight spell from my vulnerable unit so that my unit can't be traded with their Dark Enthrall. Because that's really why this is so punishing, is that their Dark Enthrall is able to get a trade with one of my units. And so here when I make this Cataclysm play, even though I'm sort of 2-for-1ing myself by attacking with or playing a spell to trade with a unit and then also trading, my unit having vulnerable sort of forces them to make this strike spell. And I was actually very happy after they played this strike spell. Even though I take 8, I'm starting to claw back into the game through value. Roji had a huge tempo advantage, and after playing that strike spell, sort of wasted 4 mana, because to me that vulnerable unit was like already dead. So
yeah, they're like double dipping on their like not extremely premium, because I think like the Unforgiving Cult is the most premium piece of interaction they've got. But by like double dipping, you are sort of like making it so that when you do your stuff, you're able to protect it more because they've already wasted a lot of damage.
Yeah.
But our hand still isn't the best. Like now we've got Aatrox, like this is our Aatrox weapon.
Yeah, so I think from that filtering, I was really looking for a 1-mana equipment so that I could play Fleet Feather, 2-drop guy, and play that equipment. Because that would have been a pretty powerful turn right here.
Yeah.
And I wasn't able to do that. But it's alright, I still find my Aatrox and have a reasonable turn here.
Tempting prospect, finding the Dark and Aegis, enough weapons equipped. There's 3. Thank goodness. Yep. So that's going to be big to stall out, right? You've got this big generation unit.
I don't know. Is this attack right? This attack felt right. I wanted to, like, I get to push more damage by attacking with my 3/4, and my opponent's tapped out, so I'm able to guarantee the trade. I haven't done any testing for if they have momentous choice yet. Like, there hasn't been a situation where I would get blown out by it, and if I wait until I block, then I give them that opportunity to win using momentous choice. So I'm pretty happy with this attack, but I think it was just a consideration, because if my unit dies, I have no blockers, and I take a lot of damage. And at the time, it just seemed like I'm supposed to take a lot of damage and try to stabilize with Aatrox, which I think is correct, given how this game ended up playing out.
Yeah, I think it makes sense because like we know what's in their head. We know that they don't have momentous choice, and like they can still like do all their pieces of interaction next, while our interactions all at like slow speed. So like they can do like fast speed stuff and burst speed stuff and sort of like annoy us then.
Yeah.
But it just feels awkward that like our best unit right now is like our best unit's stuff that can't block or keep trading off like immediately as soon as we play them. Like we haven't felt as if we've been able to justify our board presence yet.
We fell very behind when they played vulnerable on my 4-drop, and that's why I think that was a mistake. I think definitely Merciless Hunter was very punishing for the play that I made. But we're actually allowed to fall pretty behind in tempo with this deck, or pretty behind on life total. We can't really fall behind on tempo, and both sides having a can't block unit that's like the largest thing on their board means that we're really just trading life total. But Aatrox is okay as long as you're even on tempo, because he can heal you a lot. So I just need to sort of try to stabilize and not lose the game with this Aatrox.
Yeah.
And also at this point, I know, or felt like I knew, at least 2 of the 3 cards in his hand. I play around those pieces of interaction pretty much this entire game. And it's very awkward for Roji to deploy those 4-mana interaction cards. And I'm almost able to win because I make those cards incredibly awkward to use. So.
But Furious Wielder is still in the hand of Roji. If he can find just even a point of damage onto Aatrox, he actually has the opportunity to maybe get rid of it once again.
And with the Unforgiving Cold, we stop the strikes, we stop the healing. This is going to be the next obstacle for Grandpa Roji to get over. In a mid-range matchup, if your opponent plays something that's bigger than you, the amount of cards and value not only do you have to spend, but you have to find can put you so far behind if you don't answer it immediately. The Swinging Glaive gets a lucky find onto Akshan. Immediate open attack to sprinkle some damage because this Dark Enthrall cannot block.
So, I don't love this open attack. I think Roji could have very easily developed, and it's really hard for me to play Aatrox here because I tap out, and in this spot I'm pretty forced to block with Aatrox or I die. So a development, well, I don't know. I guess if I'm forced to block with Aatrox and he doesn't have the momentous choice as a punish, it would end up all right for me. But at the very least, I think the 2-drop Cultist, for example, would be a pretty good play because the way I've played this game out, I clearly have some awkward cards in my hand, and I've also drawn an Aatrox. The way this deck is built, Aatrox is the only 6-mana card in it, and I'm very highly incentivized to spend 6 mana to play Aatrox almost every game. And so I think maybe this 2-drop at the very least could have been played. Then there's a wider attack, and I still can't block because I lose to Furious Wielder, which is in Roji's hand.
Yeah, I do think that there's definitely a justification to developing. I don't know what Roji's playing around by open attacking. I think he's like doing what all of us do, and we see an opportunity to do 7 damage as an open attack and just do it. And I think it's fine for his deck to do that, but I do think it is more powerful to develop something. Unless he wants to keep up like 8 mana for next turn, like keep these cards in hand, but you don't need to. And
yeah,
I think it's perfectly fine to do that.
Yeah, Donut's down to 5, and it kind of puts you in a position where Aatrox and his healing becomes necessary, right? You just picked up the Vayne. Ideally, you'd want to be able to develop Vayne, try and look for some opportunities to get aggressive on your own. You don't want to just let Roji beat you down the entire game, but you've fallen to such a low HP point that you need to start worrying, and Aatrox getting him early, you're going to get more of those strikes, which are going to continue to heal you up.
And Donut thinking Roji doesn't have burn necessarily, but with the Varus, there is the threat of overwhelm.
Forget what I play here. I think I play Aatrox, but I might pass and then play Aatrox next turn, holding up some mana.
Notably, no rally effects in this. This is a Sivir Akshan Varus, right? It's not Demaciolus that's going to be trying to rally.
Oh, I play Fleet Feather. Interesting.
So, explain to me the logic here, doing Fleet Feather and then presumably Vayne or Durant. Unless you're going to do Fish Train.
Yeah, so I think I just didn't feel very comfortable playing Aatrox into open mana. I knew my opponent had Furious Wielder. I guess they could have had 2 copies of Unforgiving Cold, but I was pretty comfortable putting Roji on like the 2 pieces of interaction that he has, given the way he's played. But looking back on it, I think Aatrox may have been the best line. It just feels very uncomfortable to play your only win con and tap out in this situation. But looking at the ways that Roji is able to respond here, it definitely seems like that was the right play.
I guess you're thinking about like Momentous Choice Furious Wielder, right? Like that would just blow you out if you played Aatrox.
Yeah, that would like end the game on the spot. But given that I have the read that there are 2 pieces of expensive interaction in the hand, and I know that there's an equipment in the hand, my opponent has 2 cards and would have had to top deck that Momentous Choice. So
yeah, I do think that like to bring this back to like the deck building aspect, I think this emotionally is an example of why like multiple Aatroxes would have been better. Like I think you could probably justify getting another Aatrox in there to play Aatrox here because at least you've got the backup for that you do have another access to World Ender or win condition.
Yeah, I think that in testing, that was something that you guys pushed a lot.
Yeah.
But I just place very little value on having a like 1 in 30 out to draw my win condition again.
Yeah.
And I placed a lot more value on the more realistic out of like not being bricked as much.
Yeah.
If I had 2 Aatroxes in hand, definitely you feel a lot more comfortable playing your first Aatrox. But having 1 in deck doesn't make me feel almost any more comfortable playing the first copy out.
Yeah.
Challenger as well gives Grandpa Roji a chance to develop Keeper of the Box, fearsome, lifesteal, a little bit more stabilization on his side. Still
I think
has
also
mana,
I don't
covered
lose a
with the Furious
particularly
Wielder, and
large
Donut
amount
has
not
respect.
developing my Aatrox this turn.
Absolutely, but also playing the one drop does move you out of Aatrox for
Oh, and I
so
fish
we
fight
start
this
to see
auction.
fish fight instead. Trying to get utilization, and once again,
Oh, okay.
he's going to be
Past me was pretty smart. So what I was doing is I really wanted to fish fight auction. I knew my opponent had interaction, and even though my opponent had the answer to this and kept their auction alive, I wanted to effectively like open pass here, get this awkward fish fight out of my hand, and force a piece of interaction on a unit I didn't care about before I played Aatrox and continued with my game plan. It's also really nice that my Fleet Feather challenge or my Fleet Feather tracker ends up getting Challenger by playing this way. But this fish fight in particular is me trying to force out an awkward piece of interaction from my opponent or kill their auction, both of which I'm very happy with. Auction is a premium card in the deck, and so is Furious Wielder, especially in this matchup. So by using this fish fight here and the Cataclysm previously, I'm forcing my opponent to trade up in mana and cards against me, but use their premium spells that win them the game that I also know that they have. Basically, I know that these cards are going to be crushing me and providing my opponent a lot of value, so I want to force them out at times when they provide the least amount of value, even though they're still going to feel like a blowout. So I lose my best unit on board here, but I think that this trade is actually really good for me. And that was sort of the reasoning in making this play.
Yeah. At the very start of this long statement, you said your Fleet Feather would get Challenger. Am I stupid? Why does Fleet Feather get Challenger? Because you get to play.
So
Vayne.
I get to play Aatrox next turn. It's not
okay.
currently having Challenger. It just will have Challenger at some point in the future.
Right. So you mean like you'd like to play the Fleet Feather before you played the fish fight?
It let me. So Fleet Feather was played to bait a response for my opponent and get them to spend mana and tap lower. But then Fleet Feather was just like, so it was a pass action that didn't let the turn end. But on my next turn, before I attack, it'll have Challenger because I will play Aatrox.
Yeah. I do like this play. I think like it sucks because like as a spectator, it looks like to an extent that you're just like playing into the interaction, but they're gonna have the interaction no matter what. Like it's gonna exist in their hand, and you know it exists in their hand. And this is like low value, pretty much.
Yeah, this game I basically forced my opponent to play a Furious Wielder on a practically dead 4/3 Scout, which that's a pretty good card in my deck, but the way it ended up trading is I traded my 4/3 Scout, which is relatively good in my deck, for their Furious Wielder, which is their second best piece of interaction. I then also traded my Cataclysm, and they got a free 4/2 out of it. So they got a pretty big tempo advantage, but in terms of cards, we were still relatively even. And with my free draw of Aatrox and their sort of awkward hand where they didn't have a palace until very late in the game, that was pretty beneficial for me. And I felt like I could take this game long and try to outgrind my opponent in cards, even though my hand was pretty awkward. So that's kind of what this whole game plan has been about, is slowly trying to get through their interaction and run them out of cards.
Be able to use the Furious Wheeler to completely get rid of this fish fight. He does deal with the Cultist, which really, Roji didn't need to deal with the Cultist, but he's just able to keep pressure on the board, save the Akshan.
I love this play from Donut because now the Vayne can come down safely. Donut hesitating still a little bit, thinking about re-equipping this Bloodletter.
So here's Skarzig said the Vayne could come down. I had no thoughts of playing Vayne. Playing fish fight next turn with Aatrox is incredibly important. So I thought the Vayne was a little bit funny. Because next turn I have Aatrox obviously for 6 mana. I have 7 mana crystals, so having at least 1 banked mana so I can fish fight and finally get an effective value trade is how I'm going to come back in this game in both life total and like tempo on the board. I also there got the read that my opponent didn't have Momentous Choice because I felt like Momentous Choice was a much better way to save the auction than Unforgiving Cold. Although I guess I was holding up mana, so maybe they would have played the Furious Wielder either way.
He's thinking fully about, digging his way out of this hole. 5 HP versus 15. Is Aatrox going to be the game ender from this position? Now up to 7 HP.
No, it feels like there's no way. I mean, the Aatrox comes
So
down,
here I think I make... Oh no, I don't make the read that they have no Momentous Choices.
Roji thinking, yep,
When I
he's
make
gonna
this strike.
realize all of the reactivity in the world, the double Furious Wielder and now the Unforgiving Cold. This is going to deny the fish fight from Aatrox.
Okay, but with that fish fight, I have finally baited out all of the removal and interaction I knew about since the mulligan. Those cards have been in his hand that long.
Yeah.
And so now it feels more like a fair fight, even though they just drew their Varus for free and top decked their Sivir. So they've had some pretty good draws here. So have I, though, to manage to stay in the game with my abysmal starting hand.
Yeah,
But
like since your starting hand, you've drawn, I think, like 3 units, which is like basically what you needed, and like a sharp side, and that's pretty
And a
much it,
Droll.
right? And the
A
draw,
Dark
which you
Agent.
got from the Tempting
So-
Prospect.
yeah, I've drawn pretty well from the opening.
Yeah.
It's weird watching this back. I think I was playing better at the time than I am seeing my opponent's hand and being able to think about everything that they could do. It's funny to remember my thought pattern
Yeah.
and my line.
Healing as well.
believe that's a leveled Sivir when it comes down.
And remember, fish fight unequips the target they use it on.
This is a really good kind-hearted recruit.
So yeah, this is the best top deck in my deck, and for the first time this tournament, almost saves the game when I draw it. Kind-hearted recruit, just so good here. So here I think a lot and end up playing kind-hearted recruit, intending to block, I think I was intending to block Varus with my Aatrox if there's an attack. Just, I felt like I was in a position where I needed to like call the bluff or make a block. Then they play this Sivir, and I think they don't attack here after I play my Aatrox weapon on my 5/5.
That's my memory as well.
And it's pretty bad for them, but the attack isn't much better, so
It's like
really interesting spot.
Kind-hearted recruit is basically acting like a big Bright Steel Protector here, but like at least it's got more value in general than Bright Steel Protector had in this deck. And like them not having any spells like Momentous Choice to like threaten attacking, it's just like really awkward for Roji.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
that's really plays into the game plan that I'd been talking about, sort of
Yeah.
this whole game of forcing them to use their interaction pieces on awkward turns, because the best thing that they could have right now would be like an Unforgiving Cold or a strike spell. Then they get this attack for free, and I probably lose the game.
Yeah.
But I'm able to actually stabilize.
It's just interesting, like, at the time, just looking at the board state in this entire game, it looks like Roji has been ahead. And, like, in tempo, he has been ahead, in a sense, but we've been, like, getting rid of all of his interaction pieces so that now we can start doing our, like, larger plays, and they can't really do anything about it. It's such a weird way to think about the game, and, like, this is, I think, is a really good example of seeing that sort of game plan be enacted.
Yeah, I think this is actually, like, even though I end up losing this game, a really good example of how to like play a game in a macro sense, and also how to sort of read the cards in your opponent's hand. And
And
made
what's it
some
do
poor
with
reads.
that reading? Like, now that you know, what should you do?
Right? I mean, like you said, this
Yeah,
Understand.
I made a poor read with the Merciless Hunter, but the rest of my reads were like spot on, and I was able to play around them really well to have a chance in a game where I had a pretty bad draw against like a relatively good one, with a lot of the important cards in the matchup from my opponent. So
it's not incredibly impactful. Yes, a 5/5 body is a good blocker, but when you're staring down a leveled Sivir, a leveled Varus, an Akshan that's about to level up and is equipped, right? This is such a strong board from Roji, and only 7 life left on Donut.
The Darkened Blade goes over to the Harp recruit to get a big unit down. Donut's going to try to block as much as he can with just 2 units. Thinks that the math is there. If he can survive, World Ender comes through next turn. Maybe we get something going with the Aatrox, but I don't think the blocks are going to be enough.
So Grandpa
That's just a
Roji
very-
passes here.
The 6/6 can block the Varus. There is no mana.
How much damage would he have pushed if he attacked?
6.
Maybe blocking the Keeper of the Box.
So I go to 3 because I get a heal from Aatrox.
Oh, you do heal.
So
Uh,
we have to trade down this board.
Yeah, I guess like my thinking was that you were forced to block. Like you would do 6/6 here, 5/5 here, this guy here. But since like you're healing, you could probably change it around a little. But I still think that block's correct. You put that there, that there, that there.
Yeah, and then I sharp sight killing Sivir. So if he were to attack here, he loses all 3 champions and then pushes 6. So I think he's right to not take this attack,
Absolutely.
but
yeah.
he's probably wrong to have developed Sivir if playing a weapon is so crushing to this attack.
Yeah, and like he can see that weapon in hand. Like this is showing no.
Yeah, that was a face-up card.
Yeah.
So.
His alternative line is to open and like be threatening stuff and force you to do awkward blocks. But you've still got like the sharp side and him knowing his hand, and he might know that you know that he doesn't have many pieces of interaction.
Yeah, I both knew he didn't have much interaction and was also forced, at least at this moment in the game, because I have yet to stabilize with World Ender, I was forced to not play around any interaction anymore. I had played around like the most interaction I possibly could while still having a chance in the game, and I would just die if he open attacked and I didn't block. So he didn't really have the opportunity to bluff very much in this spot, as I'm just forced to make the block anyways, or I'm dead.
Yeah.
So
You're gonna have to lose. You're probably losing your Aatrox here. You're probably losing as well your 6/6. You're losing everything.
You're losing your Aatrox and your 6/6.
Aatrox goes down because the blade is equipped to Reinhardt.
yeah, this game had some interesting
Resurrect himself with that
thoughts from the casters.
I mean, casting is difficult. Source do just
Yeah.
trust me. But like,
Yeah, I mean, like, doing this VOD review, I don't want to count the attackers either, so I can see why they didn't want to
Yeah.
and didn't count the damage there.
Instead of letting his Akshan fall down to the 6/6 on the block.
So now Donut has
So this is the turn where I think I make the most meaningful misplay.
yeah.
Roji drew a not great card. I also draw. I mean, Vayne is alright, but not particularly important to what's happening on the board right now. So I'm forced to play World Ender here. It's like sort of the only line I have, and Roji has no deny. He's pretty frustrated about it. But if you think all the way back to when he didn't pick the 3/3 from his predict, he hasn't had a lot of card selection this game, and so it's not particularly unlucky, at least in my opinion, in my view of the game.
And all Glaive has done is trade into your unit on like turn 5.
Yeah, my 2/3 that grants or gives all equipped allies +1/+1.
Yeah, that's like
the
the only thing that Glaive has done, and give like Akshan this little bit of strength to go. So
Yeah.
you spent 6 mana on it and not accomplished too much. Well, if you had the 3/3, like it would have counted down a lot. It probably would have been the second half at this point, like before now, and then this would have been counted down a little bit. So
Yeah, but really importantly, I was able to cast World Ender before Roji was able to predict.
Yeah.
And I saw Roji shook his head as I cast that, but that's really the only playline that I can go for, and it's not even close. That's just the only thing that my cards do here.
right, this turn's Interesting. From memory, I wanted you to play Zolani. I think.
Yeah, so I also saw that from Twitch chat, and I think I'd considered it in the game, but I believe it doesn't get there. So I
It might
can
be something
actually
like
play
strength
Zolani
the
on
lifesteal unit.
Giral.
I presume it's strength on the lifesteal unit is why that doesn't work. Because then you're pushing
Yeah, so I have
26.
19. If I have a Zolani, then I'm pushing 26.
Yeah.
But they can just block with their champions, right? Like,
Yeah.
they only need to block 11 damage then, which isn't a particularly large amount. They can sacrifice one champion and just live. And I also lose my Giral. And at this point in the game, I've pretty much stabilized. Like, I know I know my opponent's hand has very little interaction left in it. They've obviously predicted very likely for interaction, but they shouldn't have too many cards left.
Yeah.
And so the line of play I go for is actually just to outvalue them and try to kill their champions. But I also make a pretty important misplay here when I run out of time. You can see my timer's at 2 seconds right now, which is not great for an important turn. Calculating all of the permutations of blocks in combat is really difficult. So I go for a pretty cool play here of equipping my Giral to give me another Giral in hand and playing that one for free.
Wild. I'm glad that Donut was able to showcase this mechanic. Double dipping on champions is one of the strongest things that you can do in Legends of Runeterra, and historically it's been very difficult to accomplish. So Donut being offered that rare opportunity.
And so what I should do here is, after I play this Giral, I think challenge the 2/2 lifesteal with my 4/3 Giral, challenge Varus with my 5/3 Giral because I'm threatening to kill him, and then attack with my 2 Aatroxes. And that guarantees that one of my Aatroxes lives through the turn, which then probably wins me the game. And as I'm thinking here, I'm looking at all the cards my opponent could have, particularly when I have the Giral in play. That's what I'm doing. But I'm taking time ahead of time to like calculate everything that could be blocked because I know there's a lot to think about. And I don't figure out the need to challenge Varus until I put my units in combat and line up the challengers. That really helps me visualize what I'm supposed to be doing. But as I'm lining up those challengers, I misclick right next to Varus, grab the 4/3 can't block instead of Varus, and it costs me the game almost on the spot. Although I'm able to try and attempt a comeback this game, so this game remains interesting for a few more turns.
You can use Absolver here to try and defend that, but then you're losing your Absolver.
And then Keeper the box, chilling, a little bit of extra HP. And you can see how much is riding on the decision whether to attack or not. Donut taking as much time as possible to calculate every possible and passes back.
Yep, Roji back to Donut. Donut gonna send the swing forward. 28 damage presented before the blocks come through. We're gonna see where those challenges go.
So I think originally I pull Akshan because he has the equipment on him, and I'm sort of killing 2 cards that way. And I think through all the options he could have, realize the Absolver or Momentous Choice, end up killing my unit, and pull the wrong card.
It's just as sad as on the day.
Yeah. So now I lose an Aatrox here, which is brutal. Yeah, both Aatroxes.
He was looking to try and stop any combat trick. That's why he went for double Giral instead of anything with the overwhelms. He tried
and yeah, I'm pretty frustrated with that play. But I take a deep breath, recenter, not out of the game just yet. I healed a bit that turn. And I think I actually find a relatively good out. And I'm hugely likely to win until Roji draws this card right here.
You predicted it.
Did he predict that?
No, as in like, I completely forgot what cards you were talking about, and then you're like, this card right here, I'm like, oh, what could Donut be talking about? I forgot.
Yeah, no, I remember this card.
Yeah.
So Yeah, Roji draws the Unforgiving Cold, which closes out all of my hopes of coming back into this game. That
Yeah.
card, again, is just super premium in the matchup. So,
Yeah.
but the general game plan that I end up figuring out after I refocus on the game is I'm going to need to play as Zolani, try to go wide, and kill my opponent. I actually equip Zolani on my Geralt here, though, because I can tell my opponent wants to make some attacks here and try to put pressure on me.
Yeah.
Even though Zolani is key to my method of winning the game, I need to equip it and try to generate some tempo and go a little wider by summoning a 1/1 camp block that I can equip with.
Gets another dark enthrall along with this second scout attack. Has enough mana to play the second Ranger Knight Defector and equip the dark enthrall. It gets both.
Was that pass losing to Absolver that you just done? Or was that not a
When
pass?
I just cast? I think I'm currently thinking.
Sorry, can I go back like a second? Did you just pass?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's the trade go.
Yeah,
Is
here
it-
I passed.
Doesn't this lose to Absolver?
So this loses to second Absolver.
Yeah.
Roji
Which is
had to play first
unlikely.
Absolver. But yeah, this would lose to Absolver right here.
Yeah.
I'm obviously pretty behind at this point, and I think not having or having misplayed as well. Like I'm just very behind, and I need to take risky plays. So I don't think this passes.
Yeah. Because if you
Really
develop
bad
it,
at all.
you're just losing your Vayne or you're losing your Zolani.
Yeah, I need to survive on as little HP as possible because I don't win this game if it goes long at all anymore.
Yeah.
And so I need to try to kill on my opponent's next turn. So
Yeah.
I get as much value as I can.
Yeah. I just wanted to point that out because I just noticed that you have lost to Absolver, which is unlikely. They only run 2. But
Yeah. They only run 2, and I know it can't be in the left side of their hand. So it was a straight up like 1 in 28 or something at this point for them
Yeah.
to draw that and kill me.
All of these ticking down, making this auction
I think I even take this pass here. Oh no, I don't. I would
well,
die.
you can't. Yeah.
Yeah. I said that thinking I would go to 1. I miscounted.
Dark enthralls that can't do anything versus this. Roji just goes for the open attack here, and that is going to be 5 damage put through, and Vayne going down.
Going immediately, make sure that there's nothing that can happen to save that Vayne from the.
So here I end up working it out that I get to play as much as I can here, and I will have 1 action on my opponent's next turn to play a card before they can draw with Auction. And in theory, if they didn't have Unforgiving Cold, that would make them pretty likely to draw it, and that would have really lowered my ability to win the game. But they had the Unforgiving Cold already, so that play wasn't particularly relevant. But it's all kinds of little things that you pay attention to.
Oh, look, it's the Darkened Staff.
It's the Darkened Staff. Look,
Just in
see,
time.
the best thing is it looks terrible here because none of the cards can save me.
Yeah.
So it's not the Darkened Staff's fault. So here I like look at their list and it's like, okay, I'm dead to Unforgiving Cold. My opponent has 2 top decks in hand, and he has it. I'm like, oh, okay. I think I just said wow there on camera.
Yeah, so this game I think is really, really fascinating. And I mean, like, you would hope so as well, right?
Yeah.
And I think, like, the main takeaways from this game were, like, the phenomenal hand reading that you did from the mulligan that determined, like, how to use your fish fights and cataclysms to make their cards, like, as least powerful as possible. And being able to, like, frame the game, like, permitting them to have this board state, but knowing that now your Aatrox is extremely safe, and that you pretty much had a win, provided you pulled the Varus. And I think that this game was really, really close, and I think there's a lot of interesting, like, lines and thinking found in this game that I just think that this game is, like, fascinating.
Yeah, I think this game was really good, and a lot of that's due to how long it was. This was maybe one of the longest games in Worlds, in terms of both time spent and also, like, turns gone. Like this is turn 12.
Yeah.
It's pretty crazy. But yeah, it's just over at this point.
Yeah.
So.
And so that's game 1.
And yeah, I'm pretty frustrated with myself, especially about the challenger. Yeah, anytime you make a mistake due to timer, it's the worst.
Yeah.
That's definitely something now that I'm playing in more tournaments that I want to get better at. I take a really long time on ladder, and I'm used to having a lot of time. I almost misplayed in my last game to qualify for Worlds due to timer. I had to resolve a sputtering song spitter and then use the card from it to save my Seraphine with like seconds left before my turn ended.
Yeah.
So.
Do you want to talk about the mulligan?
Sure.
I don't know what there's to say.
Yeah, so did I full keep this hand? I don't think I full kept it. But oh, okay. Yeah, I take a long time to think about my mulligans, especially in big tournaments like this. So yeah, so I don't particularly like Vile Feast in this matchup. In general, this Aatrox does Cartwheels deck has just a ton of tough units that are pretty hard to Vile Feast. And I really like Ravenous Flock, Arachnoid Sentry in general, although I keep them and they perform very poorly in this game. So it's possible that I played this wrong. I believe what I keep here, though, is Flock Gwen. Oh, no, I don't keep Gwen. Maybe we should let it play out. But
just to double check.
The logic behind not keeping Gwen and Vile... Well, so I spoke about Vile Feast. The logic behind not keeping Gwen is if I keep Flock, Sentry, and Gwen, I'm very likely to not have a 1 or 2 mana play, which I think is pretty important. And also, it forces my turn 3 play to very likely be Arachnoid Sentry, which is not really what I want to do. I think Arachnoid Sentry is very key against the Demacia decks with, what's that? The 4 mana Scout card. That's one of the best cards in Demacia right now, and Gwen's sort of only good answer to it is Sentry Flock. So I keep it because in all of our testing, that card was the most pivotal in the Aatrox matchup. So having an answer to it was really important.
I find it interesting that you say you don't like Vile Feast, because from my memory, one of the most annoying things about this matchup is Valor plus Harp. And since Roji is on Valor in his Cartwheel deck, I think that like Vile Feast becomes like an important failsafe against like Valor Harp. But
yeah,
the thing is, like, those 4 cards I don't want to see, but I want to see those 4 cards at some point in the game. It's just like very awkward to mulligan.
Yeah, no, the mulligan was definitely awkward. I think it might have been a misstep like in our testing, because we often tested against our version of Aatrox, which wasn't running Valor, and Vile Feast is particularly bad in that matchup.
Yeah, for sure.
Whereas against both Quinn and Valor, Vile Feast is pretty reasonable in this deck, even though there's a lot of tough units and the Darken Aegis that hurt your Vile Feast.
I think what makes this mulligan awkward is that like you really want to do Sentry Flock for either Vayne or for the Scout unit. You want to keep Vile Feast for Quinn or the Valor.
Yeah, so there's
but then you don't have any
one of Quinn, but
yeah. But then you don't have any like gameplay progression cards if you're keeping like 3 of these cards and then a Gwen on turn 4.
Yeah, I really need a 1 or 2 mana like hollowed unit to play for my deck to function. So
I think if I were mulliganing, I would have cut Sentry Flock and kept Gwen, and I may have cut Vile Feast. But I don't know if that would be correct. But I think that's how I would have done it.
Yeah, it's really hard to say. Definitely the way that this game in particular played out, the Sentry and the Flock rotted in my hand the entire game.
Yeah.
But this was a very unusual way for the game to play out. Roji ends up not drawing any equipment and just playing a like go wide tempo sort of game plan that my draw is awkward enough to not have good answers for.
Yeah.
I don't know if he intentionally or unintentionally does it, but I never get an even semi-reasonable Sentry Flock target for this whole game.
Yeah.
So that's a pretty awkward thing to play around.
This was a very awkward game in terms of just like how the draws work from like both sides. And I think that was also
Yeah.
true for the first game, although in the first game, like we knew at some point his 4-mana interaction would get value, and we knew at some point like we would draw Aatrox, so there's a bit more consistency in the first game. But
Yeah, I think the first game was just awkward in the way that all cultist games are, because
Yeah.
cultist interaction is like by design very awkward.
Yeah.
Whereas this game is just awkward from like reasonable, more interactive, or I don't know, Aatrox isn't more interactive, but like more reasonably priced interaction decks. It was still awkward. Roji definitely has an awkward draw here. If I was able to stabilize with him not drawing Aatrox or equipment, this would have been a pretty easy win, but he drew enough of the aggro pieces that we sort of built our deck around that he was able to take it. But we should probably have the game going.
Yeah.
We talk about the macro
Yeah.
sense of how the game played out.
I mean, I guess like there isn't much play-by-play to talk about in this matchup in particular. Oh, not the matchup, but this game in particular, just because of how it turns out.
Yeah.
I'm willing to lose to that exactly Absolver. Yeah,
We had a second sentry.
So many strong answers to what Donut was trying
Yeah.
to do in order
The second sentry is also pretty awkward. I think I only played 2, so drawing both of them is sort of awkward, but this game I think I definitely drew reasonably, especially given the way I mulliganed. Like 2 of the most awkward cards in my hand right now are the ones I kept, so it's hard to complain about that.
The beautiful early curve, double fleet feather tracker, and the steadfast Elkin. Zealous Ranger Knight also coming through. No weapons as of yet, but just has a wide board in order to strike down and keep up. Typically the Phantom Butler's very potent in early game situations, and Grandpa Roji able to use the fleet feather trackers to get the trades.
Let's see why we need Sentry. I'm curious if Sentry would have been correct. Like, pair of hindsight.
Yeah, so I just have no information about Roji's hand just yet. So it's very likely that he has an equipment and the scout unit that I'm so scared about in this matchup. And I end up losing this game, but also if I don't sentry flock the 4/3 scout, I just die to 12 quick attack damage.
So
Kidding me, right?
now this pass, I think, was interesting for a lot of people. It makes sense because you really just want to kill the scout unit, and like if you do the sentry here, they play the scout unit, they, I don't know, play catch or they do something, and then you're sort of in a lower position.
Yeah, so my hand is very awkward, and it all kind of goes back to the mulligan. I drew pretty reasonable cards, like I drew 2 2-drops, but I don't have anything very proactive to play because I've drawn my 1 of Fervor, my Harrowing, and my second copy of Arachnoid Sentry. So I just ended up drawing a pretty awkward hand, which my mulligan set me up to do some portion of the time because I kept some of the more awkward cards in the deck.
I think it's spots like these where I would have kept Gwen. Like, not just because of this one in particular, but I think like Gwen acts as like a fail-safe in just terms of like tempo and game state. And like if you had Gwen here, like she would have been able to attack into, I'm pretty sure, anything. Even like
she'd be a 5/4.
Yeah, not double catch, single catch. She would have been able to.
She beats double catch unless
there's no spell.
Darken Aegis.
Sorry, there's no spell, so it doesn't change anything.
Yeah.
Yeah. But
so yeah, the Gwen definitely would be powerful, but when I'm only running 2 Arachnoid Sentries and I'm running 3 Gwens, like keeping the interaction that I know I need to like ever kill Vayne or the Scout card just felt really important. But when Roji didn't draw those cards, it made my keep of like a very key interaction piece in the matchup really awkward. So I decided to not play the Spider here, because if I was playing the Spider here, I'd still know I need to keep Sentry Flock around for the like more important pieces of the matchup. So I would just be playing the Spider for a stun and to have a 3/2 blocker, which might have been right, but it I think actually wouldn't have impacted the way that the game played out very much because Roji would then play their Valor. And it also feels very weird to just play this card for tempo instead of passing when I am very likely to just be able to play it to punish any development my opponent makes in the future.
Yeah.
I don't have a lot of development punishes, so Roji isn't super incentivized to play around a Sentry. And also Sentry isn't particularly punishing if Roji just plays any card next turn. It doesn't ruin his game. So he's not super likely to intentionally play around Sentry and make it really hard to stun his units this game.
Roji can just chill, right? Even if I don't get weapons, I have the Quinn in hand.
But then he plays Quinn, and it's terrible.
Red Gwen, if they miss out on this early aggression and tempo, no
so here,
Gwen, then you
it looks really bad from my perspective. And I end up playing Gwen because I know I'm going to start taking a ton of damage, and Gwen seems like the best way to sort of stem the bleeding. She's the only card I can play, or she's the card I can play that saves me, I think, the most life. Actually, no, that's not true. Arachnoid Sentry on Valor would be better on the current board state, but would lose to the second Valor in my opponent's hand.
Because you will die to the rest of this board as well. There is 14 damage threatened on the attacks here, so you have to do something. And so
So by making this Gwen play, I'm pretty committed to going for a trade down and try to survive into Harrowing. And I actually end up blocking with this Gwen for that reason as well. If I take 7, my opponent's wider than me and I can't effectively develop very much, like for the rest of this game. I just have awkward units and my opponent has a lot of cheap threats they could play. Even a Gerald next turn would be really scary if I go to 7. Just any unit, even Aatrox, applies so much pressure because I'm so behind. So at this point I feel forced to flock the Quinn, and now these Arachnoid Sentries feel even more awkward in my hand. But Roji's very unhappy this whole game because he has no equipment, and then he still wins. So
now with 6 mana, we could see this Fallen Reckoner come through. Will he take the risk of the Katarina? Roji has a fish fight.
Yeah, you can see Roji kind of looking a little stressed out. You feel like, oh, he's in such a winning position. Why does he look, so stressed on his face? Why do you look upset with that draw? Well, he's looking for a weapon, right?
Here I play Fallen Reckoner, and this is the start of me dying. I could have played 2 units this turn. They just were pretty bad units, and I really felt like I needed my turn 8 Harrowing to be a win. With 2 Arachnoid Sentries in my hand, while they are very awkward, they're super likely to make me live until my next turn. On my opponent's next turn, they won't be able to develop anything into me that's threatening if I just hold up Arachnoid Sentry. But they have the Roar of Acacia to spend their spell mana on units, and then they just have more units. And really this play was a lot better if they had played like a large unit rather than going as wide as they were able to. And we just die.
I think the mulligan was definitely awkward. It's tough because, like, you can definitely imagine a world where this mulligan was like the best mulligan because they play the 4-3 and you stun it and flock it and you've gained tempo and bought it and you've drawn and you
and you keep the 4-3 in this matchup.
Yeah.
The 4-3 is what I would say the matchup often centers around. That's the main way that Aatrox applies pressure in the early game, because most of its cards trade like pretty unfavorably with the hollowed keyword, because all of their units trade and your units have upside when they trade, whereas theirs don't. But I drew like a pretty low amount of good units for the early game. I drew two drops, whereas Roji drew something like 8 or 10 efficient cheap units, which he found pretty frustrating because I think he only wanted a weapon or maybe an Aatrox, and he would have felt a lot happier. But he drew enough units that my keep of 1 like expensive big interaction spell, being Sentry Flock, never found a good home or a good place. And the one of Quinn was really good in this game. He was able to just play like a weird, almost like elite style game plan where you just play units and buff them and attack. and somehow that beat the powerhouse that is Red Gwen. So
Yeah. Your draws were also like one turn off. Like if you drew your Gwen on turn 4 and then attack with it, or you drew your Katarina one turn early to like not necessarily even get the ping up on the balance, but just being able to like threaten the ping up, I think would have been a bit better. But it was just like an awkward game overall, and
yeah, it was very awkward for Roji, and
yeah,
the awkward or the level of awkward it was for Roji made it also very awkward for me because I kept premium disruption into his deck's like main game plan, and then he drew very poorly, so he couldn't play the main game plan, had to play a very weird sort of sideline that I just had nothing good to do against.
yeah,
Because I didn't keep a hand to play against and deal with small Demacia aggro. I kept a hand to deal with Aatrox, which does some small Demacia aggro things, but usually stops being a small Demacia aggro deck around turn 4 or 5 and starts really leaning into the Aatrox game plan.
yeah. I think that's all I wanted to talk about for the Roji thing.